The Varathian Empire had been perfecting the art of conquest for 6 centuries, which in practical terms meant they had gotten very good at showing up, looking intimidating, and waiting for everyone else to do the sensible thing and give up. It was elegant, really. Efficient. The kind of system that made bureaucrats weep with joy because it came with standardized forms, predictable timelines, and a success rate that would make any insurance actuary nod approvingly. They called it the 3-stage subjugation method because the Varathians loved naming things with the creativity of a tax code. Stage 1. Arrival and demonstration of technological superiority. Stage 2. Ultimatum delivery and negotiation period. Stage 3. Integration and administrative transition. Nowhere in this elegant framework was there a Stage 4. Because Stage 4 would have been things go horribly wrong, and the Varathians had spent 600 years making sure that stage never existed. 33 species had been subjected to this method. 33 civilizations had taken one look at the Varathian fleet, done the math on their chances of survival, and decided that being part of an empire was better than being part of history. The Quilnar had deliberated for 2 days before their council of elders formally surrendered, which the Varathians considered a reasonable amount of time for a species to process their new reality. The Thexian collective, who prided themselves on their warrior culture, had held out for 6 days before their military command accepted that courage was admirable, but plasma cannons were more persuasive. The Varathians were not cruel conquerors. They didn't enslave species or commit genocide or engage in any of the behaviors that gave empire building a bad name. They simply incorporated civilizations into their administrative structure, improved their technology, connected them to the galactic economy, and expected gratitude in return. Most species eventually provided it, or at least a reasonable facsimile that satisfied the quarterly reports. This success had given the Varathians what psychologists might call justified confidence, and what everyone else recognized as the inability to imagine failure. Their military academies taught the 3-stage method as if it were fundamental physics. Their strategic planning assumed compliance. Their logistics were built around the expectation that wars would be short, cheap, and conclude with paperwork rather than funerals. Commander Vex Cole had personally overseen 12 successful incorporations, which made him something of a rising star in the Imperial fleet. He was methodical, professional, and possessed the kind of attention to detail that made him excellent at conquest and unbearable at dinner parties. When he received his orders to proceed to target designation 34, a small planet the natives called Earth, he approached the assignment with the enthusiasm of someone who had done this before and expected to do it again. The intelligence briefing on Earth was unremarkable. The dominant species, who called themselves humans, had achieved nuclear fission, rudimentary spaceflight, and global communication networks. They were divided into approximately 200 competing political entities, which was higher than average, but not concerning. Divided species were easier to conquer than unified ones. They also showed evidence of frequent warfare among themselves, which suggested they understood violence, but lacked the coordination to apply it effectively against a superior force. Commander Vex Cole read the report, filed it appropriately, and prepared his fleet for what he expected to be a textbook operation. Arrival date was calculated, fleet composition finalized, and the standard ultimatum was translated into all 4,000 languages the Varathians had on file, because attention to detail mattered even when threatening primitives. The Varathian fleet emerged from faster-than-light travel at the edge of Earth's solar system, with the precision that came from 6 centuries of practice. 400 warships arranged themselves in formation Epsilon 7, which had been mathematically proven to create maximum psychological impact while maintaining optimal firing solutions. It was beautiful in the way that overwhelming force could be beautiful. A demonstration of power so absolute that resistance became absurd. The humans noticed immediately, which was expected. Their telescopes swiveled toward the fleet. Their communication networks lit up with activity. Their military forces went on alert. All perfectly normal responses that fit within the expected parameters of Stage 1. What happened next did not fit any parameters. Instead of the usual panic, followed by attempts at communication from government leaders, the Vorathian fleet received approximately 80,000 individual transmissions from Earth within the first 3 hours. The translation computers, which had been handling galactic diplomacy for centuries, began producing results that made the communications officers question whether the software had malfunctioned. Marriage proposals, offers to exchange cultural recipes, requests for autographs, accusations that the fleet was a hoax produced by various human governments or corporations, detailed instructions on where the Vorathians could stick their invasion fleet, with several transmissions including anatomical diagrams to ensure clarity. 3 separate messages trying to sell Commander Vexcol extended warranties for his spacecraft. Are they not taking this seriously? Sub-Commander Rolfin asked, staring at a message that appeared to be a crudely drawn image of a Vorathian ship with human text that translated to Ai Lamau. They don't understand the situation, Vexcol replied, because that was the only logical explanation. Primitives sometimes needed things explained multiple times. Stage 2 commenced exactly on schedule. Commander Vexcol activated the translation matrix and broadcast the standard ultimatum to every communication device on Earth. The speech had been refined over 6 centuries, tested on 33 species, and had a 100% success rate of producing the desired response. People of Earth. His voice resonated across every medium humans used to communicate. I am Commander Vexcol of the Vorathian Imperial Fleet. Your world has been selected for incorporation into our empire. You are granted 72 hours to cease all hostilities among yourselves. Designate representatives with authority to negotiate surrender terms, and prepare for integration into our administrative structure. This is not a request. This is an inevitability. 33 civilizations before yours have chosen to join our empire peacefully. We expect you will demonstrate similar wisdom. Failure to comply will necessitate a demonstration of our military capabilities. The speech concluded. Vexcol sat back in his command chair and activated the countdown timer. According to historical data, the first official communication from Earth governments would arrive in approximately 4 to 8 hours after the initial shock subsided and survival instincts overrode pride. 12 hours later, Vexcol was still waiting for anything resembling an official response. Earth's governments were talking to each other, which the Vorathian intelligence analysts confirmed by monitoring their communication networks. The problem was, they couldn't seem to agree on anything. Some wanted to negotiate. Some wanted to fight. Some wanted to wait and see. Some were accusing each other of staging the invasion as a political stunt. 2 were threatening to go to war with each other over disputed territory, apparently having decided that an alien invasion was less urgent than a border disagreement that had been ongoing for decades. This is unprecedented, Rolfin reported. Previous species unified almost immediately when faced with external threat. They're still processing, Vexcol said, though his confidence was beginning to erode like a shoreline, facing a very slow, bureaucratic tide. Extend the deadline to 96 hours. The extension was announced. The humans responded by flooding the Vorathian communication channels with more transmissions, none of them official surrenders. Someone sent the complete text of something called War and Peace. Another transmission was just the same human word repeated 40,000 times, which the translator rendered as no. A third was a video of a human performing a dance while wearing minimal clothing, with no apparent connection to diplomacy or warfare. "I think they're mocking us," Ralphin observed. "Primitives don't mock their conquerors," Vexcol replied, clinging to 6 centuries of precedent like a drowning man clinging to a particularly bureaucratic piece of driftwood. The 72-hour deadline passed with no official response. The 96-hour extension passed the same way. Commander Vexcol, whose 12 previous conquests had gone exactly according to procedure, found himself in the unprecedented position of being ignored by a pre-spaceflight civilization. The Vorithian High Command was beginning to ask questions. Polite questions, because the Vorathians were professional even when annoyed, but questions nonetheless. Why was a routine incorporation taking longer than a contested one? Why hadn't the humans surrendered? What was the delay? Vexicol authorized Stage 1, Subsection C, demonstration of military superiority through precision strike on uninhabited target. The Vorathians selected an asteroid in Earth's solar system, one large enough to be impressive, but far enough from the planet to pose no danger. The fleet's primary weapons array reduced it to component atoms in a display of power that should have made it abundantly clear that resistance was suicide. Earth's response arrived 18 hours later. The humans launched nuclear weapons at their own moon, not at the Vorathian fleet, at their own natural satellite. 3 separate warheads, launched by 3 separate governments, apparently in competition to see who could create the largest explosion on the lunar surface. They're demonstrating their military capability, the intelligence officer reported, trying to make sense of it. They're demonstrating insanity, Vexcol corrected. What species attacks their own celestial bodies? The answer, apparently, was humans. The Psychological Warfare Division was deployed because clearly the humans didn't understand the situation and needed it explained more thoroughly. The Vorathians began broadcasting messages designed to break primitive morale by demonstrating their superiority in every measurable category. Technology, military might, scientific achievement, cultural advancement. Everything that should make a pre-space flight species realize they were hopelessly outmatched. The humans responded by broadcasting back. They sent their entertainment, hours and hours of it. Visual media showing human conflicts, human violence, human creativity in the application of destruction. Films where aliens invaded Earth and were defeated through various improbable means. Historical documentaries of human wars, complete with casualty counts that made Vorathian conflicts look restrained. News footage of humans fighting each other over resources, ideology, territory, and sometimes apparently just for practice. The psychological warfare specialists watched something called World War II and submitted requests for mental health leave. They're trying to intimidate us with propaganda, one analyst suggested. That's not propaganda, her supervisor replied, having spent 3 days analyzing human media. That's their history. They do this to each other. They've had global communications for less than a century, and they're already sharing documentation of their most violent conflicts. They're proud of it. Look at the view counts. Billions of humans watch this for entertainment. The Psychological Warfare Division submitted a report concluding that humans were either highly sophisticated in their intimidation tactics or genuinely unstable as a species. Possibly both. The recommendation was to proceed with extreme caution, which was Vorathian military code for "We have no idea what we're dealing with." 3 months into what should have been a 3-day operation, Commander Vexcol made the decision to deploy ground forces. This had never been necessary before. The threat of invasion had always been sufficient. But humans had thoroughly broken the pattern, and Vexcol was committed to restoring order through overwhelming force. 6 continents were selected for simultaneous assault. Major population centers where military resistance would be concentrated and where the sight of Vorathian soldiers would break civilian morale, the Imperial shock troops deployed in their combat armor, equipped with weapons that could level buildings and shields that could withstand anything humans could throw at them. The operation should have concluded within 48 hours. Stage 2 called for a clear demonstration of military superiority, followed by immediate surrender negotiations. Within 48 hours, Vexcol was revising his casualty projections for the 3rd time, and they kept getting worse. The Vorathian military had extensive experience fighting other species' armed forces. Soldiers fought soldiers. Clear lines of engagement, professional armies, recognizable tactics. Humans apparently hadn't received the memo about how warfare was supposed to work. In the city humans called Lagos, Vorathian troops encountered military resistance, which was expected, and civilian resistance, which was not. A food vendor threw boiling oil on a Vorathian soldier. A taxi driver used his vehicle as a weapon, ramming a combat walker hard enough to damage its gyroscopic stabilizers. A grandmother, who appeared to be approximately 80 years old in human terms, shot a Vorathian officer with a weapon that predated most humans alive, and somehow managed to hit a vulnerability in the armor that shouldn't have been accessible. In Tokyo, the humans used the city's infrastructure against the invaders. Subway tunnels became ambush sites. Building facades that appeared decorative turned out to be structurally integral, and their collapse was apparently factored into defensive plans. The Vorathian forces found themselves fighting an enemy that had weaponized their own urban environment. In New York, resistance was loud, aggressive, and involved more profanity than the Vorathian translators had previously encountered in all 33 previous conquests combined. Multiple Vorathian soldiers requested language filters for their communication systems after being verbally assaulted by humans, who apparently considered creative insults a valid combat tactic. In Mumbai, the coordination was impossible. No central command structure the Vorathians could identify, yet somehow the humans were adapting to Vorathian tactics within hours, sharing information across their networks in real time, crowdsourcing warfare like it was some kind of collaborative competition. In São Paulo, the resistance was cheerfully violent, with humans celebrating successful attacks on Vorathian positions as if they were sporting events. The Vorathian psychological analysts noted that humans appeared to have gamified their own survival, turning resistance into a competition where the prize was continued existence and bragging rights. In Moscow, the Vorathians discovered that humans had been fighting in cold climates for thousands of years and had learned lessons that weren't in any Vorathian tactical database. Also, the humans there appeared to have consumed something that made them immune to fear, pain, and common sense. 1 week into ground operations, Vexcol's casualties exceeded any single Vorathian military engagement in the last 2 centuries. 2 weeks in, he had to request reinforcements, which was humiliating but necessary. 3 weeks in, he was updating his casualty models daily and wondering if his career would survive this debacle. The fundamental problem was that humans didn't behave like conquered species. They didn't have unified command, which should have made them easy to defeat through decapitation strikes, except every city fought independently. Every region had different tactics. Sometimes individual neighborhoods had their own strategies. Some humans surrendered immediately, then attacked the moment Vorathian soldiers relaxed. Some fought, then tried to surrender, then fought again when the Vorathians attempted to process the paperwork. Some just kept fighting regardless of casualties, injuries, or rational self-interest. The Varathian combat doctrine was built on efficiency, training, and technological superiority. The human combat doctrine appeared to be built on spite, improvisation, and a fundamental refusal to accept reality. Varathian soldiers were better equipped, better trained, and better coordinated. Human soldiers were angrier, more creative, and had apparently made "we'll figure it out as we go" into a functional military strategy. "They're treating this like a game," one Varathian officer observed, watching footage of humans celebrating the destruction of a Varathian supply depot. "They treat everything like a game," another replied, having spent too many hours analyzing human culture. "They compete over everything: physical activities with arbitrary rules, consumption of food, problem solving. They've turned competition into a fundamental characteristic of their species. And now they're competing to see who can kill more Varathians. We're losing." That was the unspoken truth in every report, every briefing, every conversation. The casualty ratios were wrong. Varathian combat models predicted 1 Varathian casualty for every 1,000 primitive combatants. The actual ratio in urban combat was closer to 1 for every 70. In some engagements, it was 1 for every 40. The humans were dying at higher rates, yes, but not at the rate that would make the conquest sustainable. They were supposed to break. Every model said they should break. The Quilnar had broken in days. The Thexians had broken after a single major battle. Humans had been fighting for 3 months, and if anything, they seemed to be getting more enthusiastic about it. Vex Cole sent increasingly detailed reports to High Command. The humans were reverse engineering captured Varathian technology. They were bad at it, producing equipment that barely functioned and occasionally exploded. But they were learning. They were sharing information across their global networks faster than the Varathians could adapt. They were crowdsourcing tactics, allowing millions of humans to contribute ideas that got tested in real combat and spread if they worked. Most disturbing, they were not intimidated. Every psychological model predicted they would be intimidated. Fear was a rational response to overwhelming force. Humans seemed to have decided that fear was optional, and they were opting out. "They're stubborn," Ralphin offered during a strategy session. "Stubborn implies they're being unreasonable about something rational." Vex Cole replied, reviewing casualty reports that kept getting longer. "This isn't stubbornness. This is pathological refusal to acknowledge mathematical reality." The turning point came when a human force captured an intact Varathian supply ship in orbit. This shouldn't have been possible because humans didn't have spacecraft capable of orbital combat. What they had were chemical rockets, orbital construction equipment, and a complete willingness to strap explosives to anything that could reach space. 17 human spacecraft, if they could be called that, launched toward the supply ship. 14 were destroyed by point defense systems. 2 missed entirely and drifted off into space, presumably with very surprised humans aboard. 1, through a combination of luck, timing, and what the Varathians could only describe as aggressive optimism, managed to dock with the supply ship before anyone realized what was happening. The supply ship's crew of 37 fought a boarding action against 14 humans in what amounted to pressure suits with weapons duct taped to them. The Varathians should have won easily. They didn't. The humans won through tactics that the Varathian combat database had no reference for, including one human who apparently used another human as a projectile weapon. The captured supply ship gave humans access to intact Varathian technology, advanced weapons, and most critically, communication equipment capable of broadcasting to the rest of the Varathian Empire. The message that went out was simple. Earth says no. 2 words, Two words that shouldn't have mattered because the Varathian Empire had 6 centuries of successful conquest behind it and the might to enforce its will. But those 2 words reached 33 conquered worlds. Species that had surrendered because resistance seemed impossible. Civilizations that had accepted Varathian rule because they had been shown the mathematical inevitability of defeat. And they heard, for the first time, someone saying no. The Quilnar started having protests. Small ones, easily dispersed, but protests nonetheless. The Thexian collective began slow working their assigned duties, rediscovering their warrior pride through small acts of defiance. The Pleniks, who had been model subjects for 200 years, started asking questions about their incorporation agreement. The Varathian High Command noticed. The Varathian High Command did not appreciate what they noticed. Commander Vexkol received a quantum communication from the Supreme Military Council. The conversation was professional, as Varathian communications always were, but the subtext was clear. Earth is becoming a symbol, the Supreme Commander stated. Symbols are dangerous to administrative stability. Earth is one planet, Vexkol replied, though his conviction was crumbling like a poorly maintained fortress wall. We have sufficient resources to complete the incorporation. At what cost? We've diverted 4 fleet groups. We've sustained more casualties than the last century combined. We've had to increase security on 6 conquered worlds. And every day we continue gives other species more time to question their own compliance. Withdrawing will show weakness. Prolonged struggle shows weakness. A dominant power doesn't need months to subdue a pre-space flight civilization. It subdues immediately, or it moves on. Vexkol wanted to argue but found he couldn't. The mathematics were clear. Earth was costing more than it would ever produce. The principle demanded they continue. The economics demanded they stop. What are your orders? Vexkol asked, already knowing the answer. The Supreme Commander was silent for a moment that stretched longer than it should. 6 centuries of unbroken success, of the 3-stage method working exactly as designed, of conquest as reliable as orbital mechanics. All of it colliding with one species that had refused to read the script. Strategic redeployment, the Supreme Commander finally said. We are postponing Earth's incorporation pending further analysis of their developmental trajectory. Military euphemism for retreat. For admitting that the cost exceeded the benefit. For acknowledging that the pattern was broken. Vexkol felt something he had never experienced in 12 successful conquests. Relief. Relief that he wouldn't have to feed more Varathian soldiers into Earth's urban warfare grinder. Relief that he wouldn't have to explain to more families why their relatives had died conquering a planet that should have surrendered in 72 hours. The Varathian fleet withdrew over 6 days, slowly enough to maintain the appearance of choice, quickly enough to suggest they had more important priorities elsewhere. The official imperial statement declared that Earth had been granted an extended evaluation period, and that incorporation would be revisited when human civilization had matured to appropriate developmental metrics. Everyone knew it was diplomatic fiction. The Varathians weren't coming back. Not to Earth. Not to the species that had broken 6 centuries of precedent. On Earth, the humans immediately began arguing about who deserved credit for the victory. Every nation claimed the primary role. Every military force insisted their tactics had been decisive. Every region wanted acknowledgement of their contribution. Within a week, they were back to arguing about borders, resources, trade agreements, and all the disagreements that had existed before the Varathians arrived. But something fundamental had shifted. For a brief period, humanity had been united against an external threat. They had proven that when sufficiently motivated, they could coordinate despite their fractious nature. They had demonstrated that their competitive, argumentative, chaotic approach to existence was somehow also a strength. The galaxy learned something too. The Quilnar rebelled 8 months after Earth's victory. Their uprising was suppressed, but it took 3 months instead of 3 days, and the casualty ratios were concerning. The Thexian collective rebelled a year later, and this time they won their independence. The Plenix didn't rebel so much as they stopped cooperating, and passive resistance from an entire species turned out to be harder to combat than active warfare. The Varathian Empire didn't collapse. 600 years of infrastructure couldn't vanish overnight. But it fractured. Conquered territories demanded renegotiated agreements. Subject species started making demands backed by the implicit threat of Earth-style resistance. The Varathians found themselves negotiating instead of dictating, compromising instead of commanding. The pattern was permanently broken. 5 years after the failed Earth invasion, the former subject species convened a conference to discuss their new relationship with the Varathians. They invited human representatives, curious about the species that had changed everything. The humans sent 12 different delegations representing different regions, governments, and philosophies. They spent the first day of the conference arguing with each other about who should speak first. The other species watched in fascination and horror as humans somehow cooperated while competing, agreed while arguing, and made progress while contradicting each other constantly. "How did you do it?" a Quilnar diplomat asked during a reception. "How did you resist when all of us surrendered?" The human representative, a military officer with scars from the invasion, considered the question. "We didn't know we couldn't win. Nobody explained to us that resistance was impossible, so we just kept trying until something worked." "You succeeded through ignorance of your own limitations?" "We succeeded through refusal to accept anyone else's assessment of our limitations. There's a difference. Ignorance is not knowing something. Defiance is knowing something and choosing not to care. But you were inferior in every measurable way." The human smiled, and it wasn't entirely a happy expression. "We've been inferior to nature our entire existence, inferior to weather, to disease, to our own worst instincts. We lose constantly. We're just really bad at staying lost." The Quilnar diplomat considered this. And now, what will humanity do with their independence? Probably spend the next century arguing about it. Build some spacecraft. Figure out faster-than-light travel through trial and error, emphasis on error. Find something new to compete over. The human paused. "Why do you ask?" "The galaxy is curious about your intentions." "Our intentions are to keep existing and see what happens. Same as always." "That's it? That's everything." Commander Vex Cole, retired and living on a quiet colony world far from Earth, published his analysis 3 years after the withdrawal. The document was titled Strategic Assessment: Why Earth Incorporation Failed and Should Not Be Reattempted. It became required reading at Varathian military academies, not as a manual for conquest, but as a warning about assumptions. In the final section, he wrote, "The 3-stage method succeeded for 6 centuries because it was built on rational actors responding rationally to overwhelming force. Humans are not irrational, but they are unreasonable. They understand they are outmatched and attack anyway. They acknowledge superior force and treat it as motivation rather than deterrent. They calculate the odds of success and proceed when those odds are unacceptable. There is no stage in our method for species that choose principle over survival. We could have destroyed their world, but they would have died fighting, and in doing so would have transformed us into the thing we claimed we were not, destroyers rather than incorporators. We withdrew not because we couldn't win militarily, but because winning would have required becoming something we were not willing to become. They didn't defeat us through strength. They defeated us by making victory more expensive than we were willing to pay. The galaxy adjusted to its new reality. The Varathians remained powerful, but no longer dominant. Former subject species became partners, negotiating from positions of leverage rather than supplication. The careful order of empire gave way to the messy complexity of confederation. And Earth? Earth built a space program that made safety regulators from other species file formal complaints about humans strapping themselves to controlled explosions and calling it transportation. They reverse-engineered Varathian technology into something that worked better and broke more often. They started exploring their local stellar neighborhood with the same enthusiasm they had brought to resisting conquest. "Do you think they'll be peaceful?" a Plenix engineer asked, watching human spacecraft conduct what appeared to be a race around their moon. "I think they'll be themselves," a Thexian observer replied. "And I think we should be grateful we're not their enemies." "Are we their friends?" "I think we're people they haven't competed with yet." 3 decades after the invasion, humanity had a functioning interstellar capability built from Varathian technology, human innovation, and what could only be described as optimistic engineering. They still didn't have a unified planetary government, which other species found baffling. The answer was, they didn't need one. They cooperated when necessary, competed constantly, and somehow made progress through structured chaos that looked like dysfunction from outside, but was apparently sustainable from within. The Varathian Empire, or what remained of it, existed on the far side of the galaxy and showed no interest in returning to Earth. The former subject species had formed a loose confederation that actually invited human input on governance, which everyone agreed was a mistake because humans contributed ideas about individual rights and democratic representation that made efficient administration significantly harder. But the galaxy adapted. Patterns broke. New patterns formed. The universe continued not caring about anyone's carefully laid plans. And somewhere on Earth, in hundreds of languages, in thousands of cities, humans continued arguing about everything while simultaneously building spacecraft, developing new technologies, and preparing to export their particular brand of chaos to the wider galaxy. The Varathians had thought humans would kneel. Humans had thought kneeling was for people who hadn't tried standing. The galaxy had learned that sometimes the most dangerous thing in the universe wasn't the biggest fleet or the most advanced technology. Sometimes it was a species too stubborn to accept someone else's definition of impossible, too competitive to follow someone else's rules, and too contrary to care that they were supposed to lose. The invasion of Earth had failed not because humans were stronger or smarter or more advanced. It had failed because humans were humans, and that turned out to be sufficient. More than sufficient. An entire galaxy had reorganized itself around the revelation that the script was optional. The pattern could break, and 6 centuries of precedent could end because one species decided that no was a complete sentence. For the first time in 600 years, someone had fought back against an empire that thought conquest was inevitable. They hadn't won through superior tactics or better equipment. They'd won through worse planning, executed with better attitude. They'd won because nobody had told them they couldn't. And when someone finally did, they'd already decided not to listen. And in the end, that made all the difference. The galaxy would never be quite the same. The Varathians would never quite recover their certainty. the former subject species would never quite return to compliance. And humanity. Humanity remained blissfully unaware that they were now the galaxy's biggest concern, happily building spacecraft, exploring space, and arguing with themselves about everything while the rest of the galaxy watched nervously and wondered what they'd done by teaching humans that resistance was possible. The universe's greatest irony was that the species that had broken an empire might turn out to be more problematic than the empire ever was. But that was a problem for tomorrow. Today, Earth had won, and tomorrow they'd probably find something new to argue about while accidentally changing the galaxy again.